Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Bob Leibel. I am a senior organizing consultant here at the Sentencing Project, and we are extremely excited to have so many folks with us here for this webinar, which we're calling Unlocking the Vote, Using Data to Expand Voting Rights. We would like to thank our co-sponsors for this webinar, Forward Justice, Grassroots Leadership, and Initiate Justice, who are joining us today. And we would also like to thank our really terrific panel, who I'm going to introduce now. Our panel includes Al Barentine, the Director of Technology and Data Science at the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, Robert Lilly, the Criminal Justice and Participatory Defense Organizer at Grassroots Leadership here in Austin, Texas, Antoinette Ratcliffe, the Executive Director of Initiate Justice in California, Dr. Robert Stewart, the Assistant Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, Dr. Hannah Walker, Associate Professor of Government and Director of Research for the Initiative for Law, Society, and Justice at the University of Texas at Austin, and Jarvis Johnson, a Senior Campaigns and Data Manager for Forward Justice in North Carolina. We're incredibly excited to have everyone here with us. As most people joining this webinar probably know, 2024 is shaping up to be an historic election year with debates over voting rights and criminal legal issues taking center stage. However, too often not discussed or misunderstood is how people with justice system involvement are mobilizing to make their voices heard through civic engagement processes. Across the country, more than 4.4 million people are disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. But the news isn't all bad. That number has declined from 6.1 million in 2016, thanks to advocacy efforts that have returned the right to vote to millions of people with felony convictions in states around the country. Last year, New Mexico and Minnesota passed landmark pieces of legislation to return voting rights to people on felony parole and probation following advocacy efforts that were led by directly impacted people and communities. And just this month, Nebraska returned voting rights to those off of felony parole, eliminating a 2-year waiting period. Today, we are hosting this conversation between academics and advocates who are using data and research to advance voting rights campaigns. We will look at what the data shows as effective ways to engage justice-impacted people and communities. We'll look at some of the emerging areas of research in this field, and we'll also explore how involvement in research projects helps bolster community organizing and advocacy efforts to build power and expand the franchise. And I would like to note that this hour is really what we hope is just the beginning of this conversation. There is innovative research and the utilization of data happening in locations across the country, including by many other people in the audience today. So if you have information or resources to share, we really encourage you to do that in the chat. And we would also encourage you to use the Q&A box to ask questions, because we're going to be hopefully collecting a few questions to ask our panelists towards the end of this call, if we have a couple of minutes at the end. And so with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Robert Lilly. And the format of this is I'm going to sort of ask our panelists questions, and then we're going to kind of have a conversation about these issues in a Q&A format. And so our first panelist is Robert Lilly, a good friend of mine and a community organizer with Grassroots Leadership. And Robert, you're working alongside an academic research team, including Dr. Walker and others around the country, on a research project on voting rights. Can you talk about why you're involved in this work and what role impacted leaders and community organizing groups can take in this kind of research? And Robert, you take yourself off mute, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Peace and blessings to you all. I want to say thank you to the Sentencing Project and to all the organizers behind the scene that made this possible. I want to say from the beginning that my answer to that question would be, I heard a minister say once that your ministry grows out of the context of your crisis. So I'm 53 years of age. I've spent approximately 21 years of my life incarcerated. I live in a country by birth that I was given rights in, that because of the incidents of my life and criminalization And then being labeled a felon, I've now been reduced to less than a full citizen. This is, in my opinion, an affront to my dignity and my humanity as a human being, number one. And first, it's a contradiction to the ideals that we are taught as children and raised on in society, that we live in a democratic society that values laws, that values participation, and that values, that each vote counts, right? So in this 53 years of life, I participated in the voting process once, two times in one period of my life. And I got a chance to feel what it was like to make decisions about my welfare, my community's resources, the leadership that I wanted. And to have that removed again from me, it almost felt hopeless for a moment. But then I realized I'll be on parole until 2050. If I live that long, I'll be 81 years of age. So the reason why I'm participating in this particular project is because if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? If I don't get involved, if I don't determine that my life is meaningful, if I don't say that we can together resist these tyrannical policies that are archaic and rooted in ancient Greek ideas of tainted blood and civil death, then it is, in my humble opinion, a waste of the breath that I have left in my lungs. So it is imperative, I believe, for me as a formerly incarcerated person to lend my voice, to lend my hands. This is my way of being politically active. I can't vote, but I can use my voice. I can't push the lever, but I can push the buttons of the people around me. So you also, in your question, you asked, how can impacted leaders, because I'm one. I'm in a circle of people. All the years that I've been incarcerated, I've got to take what those have meant harm for me, and I've got to learn to use it for good. So in the times that I've been incarcerated, the prison was a site of political development for me. I began to question what was happening in my life. I began to question poverty. I began to question, why me? Why so many like me that are Black and brown are going into prison and cycling in and out? And as I began to do that, I looked back at history and I saw that what's happened in, after the Civil War with disenfranchisement is the same phenomenon that is occurring today. And so I believe ultimately that once we understand that this is a regeneration of old oppressions revisited upon a new generation, we've got to energize people. I read Dr. Walker's book called Mobilized by Injustice. If I hold it up right here for those who can see it. In this book, she encourages people like myself to help others understand that what we're experiencing is a form of injustice. And if people, the research shows that if folk can understand their experiences in conjunction with targeted oppressive forces, they can be mobilized. So leaders amongst this population, because I've met many of in my journey, we have to begin to energize those similarly situated leaders to get involved. Lastly, organizations. You ask organizations, how can criminal justice organizations be involved in this process? We come home from prison, many of us, and we need resources. We go to these institutions and we engage with them in the most humble of circumstances. This is where we're receptive. If these organizations can be involved in activating us to get energized in the cause for our liberation, then I believe ultimately there's a greater chance for us to mobilize the masses of our folk in this community to bring about significant changes. I want to be a part of this moment. I don't want to be on the sidelines watching history. I want to be in the parade making history. And I feel like that's what I have an opportunity to do today. So I want to say thank you very much for your question. I'm going to yield back to you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate it. Dr. Walker, we got a visual of your book. Can you please tell us a little bit about your research that you and your team have undertaken on voting rights, what the results might tell us for how justice impacted people are mobilized into civic engagement, although Robert may have just summarized it as well as we can. And then also what's in the works for this year for you and your team?
Yeah, yes, happily. Thank you so much to the Sentencing Project and to you, Bob, for convening us all. And thank you, Rob, for shouting out Mobilized by Injustice. I really appreciate it. So I'll try to give a brief overview. And Bob, I trust you if I'm rambling on too long that you'll cut me off. Mobilized by Injustice is my first book. And it just, when I started working on these questions, the question of, what is the impact of experiences with the criminal justice system on American democracy? How do experiences with the criminal justice system impact political attitudes and behavior? The lay of the land was of the scholarly land was really like very much about the extent to which these kinds of experiences demobilize people and push them away from a political life. And so what I do in Mobilized by Injustice is ask, okay, under what conditions do those same experiences actually mobilize people? So I started working on this book, just for context, in 2014 in the midst of the sort of first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement, and was seeing in our political life that people were becoming mobilized, and that didn't quite match up with the scholarly story. So I wanted to know what were the conditions under which people became mobilized. Through that, in that book, I found that people become mobilized when they connect their experiences to a larger collective struggle for justice, when they understand themselves as unfairly targeted by the criminal legal system for contact, or they understand their experiences as discriminatory or otherwise inhumane. But it's also really a book about protest politics. It doesn't have much to say about the conditions under which people vote. It instead talks about how people, when they become mobilized, may engage in other kinds of political activities. And so what I and my team are doing in our current iteration of projects is we're saying, okay, well, given what we know about how the system serves to marginalize folks, given what we know about the conditions under which people become mobilized, how can we begin to assist in efforts that are already occurring to build political power among justice-impacted people, and to channel some of that energy that we see evident in the streets into electoral power? And so that's sort of the place that we begin with our current projects. And so we have done a suite of field experiments that are targeted to people with felony convictions who retain the right to vote, to try to understand how to get those folks to register and turn out. The first set of experiments that we did were in North Carolina in 2020, where we were really just trying to understand, can we find people? And if we find them, if we reach out to them and encourage them to register and explain eligibility and remove some knowledge barriers around how to exercise one's right, can we improve engagement? And we found that we could. So in that experiment, again, simply reaching out, asking people to participate, providing them with information about their rights and information about how to navigate the electoral process can get folks re-engaged in the electoral process. So then in 2021 in New Jersey, we did a follow-up experiment, but this one was really special because it came right on the heels of New Jersey having changed its law to extend the right to the franchise to people who are still serving time on probation and parole. And it was also really special because we partnered with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice on that project. And we started with some qualitative work where we were listening to folks talk about, why it was important to them to vote justice-impacted people, why they became engaged in the effort to have the law extended, and what their own experiences were in terms of trying to get folks like them to actually then get who were newly enfranchised to get them registered. So we used that qualitative work to then inform some messaging strategies, and found through that experiment that the most effective messenger is the person who is themselves formerly incarcerated, a trusted messenger, someone who has had experiences with the criminal legal system themselves. So then in Texas in 2022, we did another follow-up, but this time, we're building on this idea that a trusted messenger is really effective, that it's the person who is themselves justice impacted who's the most effective messenger. But based on some of the work that I did in Mobilized by Injustice and in some of the things that were coming out in the interviews in New Jersey, we really started to think to ourselves, you know what? We actually think that the most effective messenger is not just someone who has a shared background with justice-impacted people who retain the right to vote, but actually someone who has a pre-existing relationship with that person, right? So what we wanted to know in Texas in 2022 was, can we find the already politically mobilized loved ones of people with convictions who retain the right to vote, and can we get them to help us then go and get their person registered and turned out? So that's what we did in 2022. We had some really encouraging results from that project. And so now in 2024, we're turning turning our attention to testing some of these strategies, again, under a larger experimental framework. But the really exciting thing that we're doing is we're working in collaboration with Rob and the folks at Grassroots Leadership to implement a relational organizing experiment in Austin and Houston around the 2024 election, where we're going to instead build our list through starting with justice impacted people themselves and working with those folks to reach out to folks who are not yet engaged to bring them into the electoral process. So I think there's lots of stuff in the chat. I'll go ahead and stop there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Dr. Walker, for that terrific overview. Turning to you, Dr. Stewart, you've been a part of some of the seminal research projects on the scope and the depth of how criminal convictions too often exclude people from full participation in our democratic processes, in addition to other collateral consequences. Can you talk a little bit about how this research has been informed by and used by advocates working to change policy around these issues?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I mean, that's a good question, because I think that when it comes to developing the data and getting it out into the world, I think there are a lot of assumptions that people make about the who are impacted. I think there's a lot of assumptions that people make about the what the potential impacts are, and I think that developing the data and making the data accessible to people on the ground is a really important component of this. I've been blessed to first off, let me say that thank you to Rob for sharing his experience. I was disenfranchised for 10 years, which is what got me interested in this in the first place. It was after prison that I became involved. I knew I couldn't vote, but I wanted to still be involved. And so I went to a local precinct caucus and learned, oh, by the way, I can't participate there either. And so really kind of understanding how that can, it's not just you can't vote, there's a lot, there's so many more barriers. And so in graduate school, I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Chris Eugen at the University of Minnesota, and to really start to think and explore how things like disenfranchisement it's not just one thing, it's part of a larger package of experiences that come along with having this type of criminal record. Trying to relearn how to navigate, or learn, I guess, how to navigate through life with these potential barriers. And so I was able, while in graduate school and working with Dr. Eugen, to be able to participate with some of the work with, putting out developing some of the estimates for the sentencing project and trying to understand how many people are actually impacted. And I think, Bob, initially you mentioned at the top that there were 6.1 million people disenfranchised, at least we estimate, in 2016. And now it's dropped by about a quarter, right? Up until this point, which is huge. I mean, that's a really big deal. And so for me, what's been really important is to be able to get the data out in a way that can be usable, not just not just to get it out in journal articles and things like that, but get it out to people, in the hands of the people that are going to make use of it, right? So I can give you some examples. For example, in Minnesota, restoring voting rights to people who are not incarcerated had been a movement for quite a long time, but really had not seen a bunch of headway. And it was really about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we were able to kind of bring together different data sources to kind of triangulate the data to really to make clear that, look, this is not just a Twin Cities problem. This is a full state problem, because we were able to show, look, 65% of people who were disenfranchised at the time in Minnesota did not live in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They lived out in where I'm from, in the rural parts of the state, right? And so, I think by presenting information like this to policymakers and also people on the ground, it really goes to show, this is really impacting everybody in the state. And we also were able to, through some of these efforts, get a sense of where people were and maybe, help identify people who were disenfranchised in, certain policymakers' districts to help engage that conversation, which is really, I think, which I believe was the beginning of the long term that ended up in the success that we saw last year in 2023, where finally Minnesota did restore voting rights. And so that's upwards of 47,000 people who are getting their voting rights back, and they can vote now in 2024. And so it's really exciting. And this is a lot of people in particular who I think I've been doing some research looking at prosecuting people for voting, right? So different states are prosecuting for, we saw this in the lead up to the last presidential election in particular in the state, sorry, Al, but in Florida and some other places where high level executives would talk about trying to prosecute people for exercising their voting rights, or in some cases just registering. And some of the work that I'm working on now is trying to focus on, like, what does that actually mean to convict somebody for doing amongst the most pro-social things that we could ask people to do, right? And reading through the charging documents and reading through the statements that people make, I mean, it's heartbreaking. I mean, stories of people saying, look, like, my daughter is asking me why is mom going to vote, but you're not, and so I really felt really bad about it, and I was just going to go in, and I ended up voting, and now I'm going to get a felony conviction for it, another one, right? And like, what is the value in that? What purpose does that serve? And so, sorry, this was a little bit of a ramble, but but I think by one of the things that I really hope to do, if I could do anything else, I hope that I can get people to really reevaluate the linkage that we have between voting and punishment. Why are those two things together, right? I think Rob mentioned that the historical legacies, going back all the way ancient Greece type of stuff. But I think we need to disentangle these things, right, and really kind of rethink how we're doing it. And so with that, I'll just pass it back to you, Bob.
Great, thanks, Rob. That's yeah, I think those are great questions for us to grapple with, and I think we might revisit them in the questions, actually. So really appreciate that overview. Let's switch out to California. Antoinette, we want to go to you. Initiate Justice, your organization, has what seems to be something of a unique model, right, of reaching back into prisons to survey people who are currently incarcerated to drive your work. Can you tell us a little bit more about how and why y'all developed that model, and what campaign decisions it has informed? I think that one of the themes throughout this conversation really is, how is research also used as organizing? And it feels like what Initiate Justice is doing really combines the two in a unique way. So we'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. And first, I just have to express so much gratitude for you, Robert, for you, Dr. Walker, and also you, Dr. Stewart, for the things that you've already mentioned, because those many of those facets are actually the fundamentals of our organization, of Initiate Justice, and why we were founded. So as Dr. Walker named, the most effective messenger is the person who is impacted by the issue, the person who is formerly incarcerated, the person who is currently incarcerated, the loved ones of people who are currently or formerly incarcerated. And that is essentially the fabric of Initiate Justice. So when we were founded in 2016, we served as trusted and credible messengers, people who were at the time currently incarcerated, people who were loved ones supporting people through incarceration, served as trusted and credible messengers, getting people inside of California state prisons information about the changes in law that would impact them. So our co-founders understood the very things that were named here, that Robert, that you shared. People inside have a voice and can use that voice. Also the same things that Dr. Stewart, that you shared around disenfranchisement being a larger part of the experience of incarceration, and not having the ability to exercise that without, tools and support. And so our co-founders understood that people who have these experiences, who are experiencing the conditions, the systems that are in need of change, that are in need of transformation, are the ones with the most critical insights to bring forth those solutions. And that we needed to have or be a source of information for our decision makers, for our legislators, by authentically representing the actual lived experiences of people inside, of loved ones, of people formerly incarcerated, to those who had grave misconceptions and were making decisions about our lives. including our greater public. And so that's why our inside, outside organizing model, where information flows both ways, including surveying people inside, was developed. You asked how, right? How do we do this? So in 2016, when we were founded, we had a few hundred people in California prisons on our mailing list. Now we have over 40,000 throughout the state of California, with over 400 of those being trained community organizers, advocates, and mentors. We did this by being the trusted source, the trusted messenger for accurate, for timely information, by uplifting the authentic stories and experiences, as opposed to attempting to confine people to traditional constructs or beliefs or values. And so I think that is why research and data as a method for organizing is so critical. Research is usually approached in a very traditional way, but the fact of the matter is we're not traditional, or those ways are out of touch with our actual communities, with people like Robert, both Roberts, Dr. Stewart and you, Mr. Lilly. And so that's the importance, and that's why, research and data as a method for community organizing, when data scientists, when researchers, when academics like you, Dr. Walker, collaborate intentionally with advocates and community members like us, what we can achieve are not just data points, but it's using that data to tell the complete story, tell the how, tell the who, tell the why. Who are people beyond, as Robert, Lilly, as you said, beyond the labels forced upon them by society? How are those experiences, or our experiences, impacting the ways we exist in our society? And how can we learn from those experiences to inform change? As you said, Dr. Stewart, it's a part of a larger package of experiences that come with being involved and touched by the criminal justice system. And why particular issues are important, like the one we're talking about today, ending felony disenfranchisement across the nation. So you asked about sort of the campaigns that it has, or our efforts have informed. And in 2019, Initiate Justice, we released our Democracy Needs Everyone report. This was a survey conducted particularly people who are on parole and people who are currently incarcerated, with the intent to provide statistical data about how can California's political system be different if people impacted by incarceration had their voting rights restored. At this time, people on parole could not vote. People in prisons completing their sentence could not vote. People in prisons completing their sentences still cannot vote. And so what the data showed, what we were able to communicate broadly and widely, was that overwhelmingly, if people incarcerated or on parole could vote, they would. You heard from several people before me, they would vote, they would use their voice. The top reasons people wanted to vote, the data showed, were to have a voice in society, as Robert Lilly mentioned, to contribute positively to communities, to have a say in who leadership is, your elected leadership. And the top 3 issues that the data showed were most important to the people we surveyed were jobs in the economy, education, and healthcare. So the data was able to illustrate those things, and also more about who people are in our California prison system, and also people who were on parole at the time, and what would have prevented their incarceration in the first place. And that was really critical to inform our organizing around the issue. At the time, working to pass Proposition 17 to restore voting rights for people on parole in California. It was critical because the questions when advocates started talking about restoring voting rights were things like, do people impacted by incarceration even want to vote? They were questions like, is this in the best interest of our community's safety? Questions like, do people, why do people even care about this issue? And we were able to answer those questions, address those questions with statistical evidence to help people better understand why this was necessary for all our communities. And it worked. California voters overwhelmingly supported Proposition 17, restoring voting rights to people on parole in California. Now the question is, when will Californians restore voting rights for people still completing their still completing their sentences? And the Free the Vote Coalition that Initiate Justice is an establishing member of attempted to bring that before the voters this year through ACA 4, but the traditional data showed dwindling support for the issue. And so we believe that's largely in part because people don't have the complete information. That is where this happens. What's happening here today, this conversation here today, the work that everyone here today is doing, and the phenomenal work that the Sentencing Project is doing. And we're working right now in Initiate Justice, we're working to replicate the approach that we used with the 2019 Democracy Needs Everyone report, because we know, as I'm sure very well, many people here today know, that democracy still needs everyone. It still needs all of us. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. I think that's a great segue, actually, and really, really inspiring work in California to see the trajectory of groups that have grown up around enfranchisement efforts and then are continuing to push for full enfranchisement of all of our people, regardless of their incarceration status. And so now to turn to somebody who has been deeply embedded in this work for some time now. Al Barentine, you're a researcher and a data specialist with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and you're a data specialist who's embedded in an advocacy organization. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that model to help advance campaigns, how does that model help advance campaigns where you have researchers actually embedded in community organizations? And are you seeing it duplicated in other parts of the country?
Yeah, and I hope if you ask me that in a couple of years, we'll be able to say, yes, it's everywhere, every state. But yeah, so I'm the data scientist for Desmond Meade and the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, but also am kind of in most of the spaces that Desmond's in as well, which he's in more spaces than you think sometimes. I'm always surprised. I'm like, oh, you helped with that, huh? And that's really been, it's really been powerful. So, I came to Florida, I came to Florida because I speak Spanish and they tell you to go to Florida. But basically, I met up with, or I found out about felony disenfranchisement in Florida and the pernicious problem there from the Sentencing Project report. So that was, and I'm someone who, though I come from the tech world and I've, been in tech and machine learning, I've made a bunch of contributions to open source. Every time you type an address into your phone, pretty much you're using a machine learning model I've released. And basically, but I'm also somebody who has, is deeply impacted by the issue. I haven't been to prison myself, but every male member of my family has spent time inside and or has had felony conviction. I had people who've been away for 20 years and someone who actually died in the system. And so I realized that kind of coming from a lower income background and being the first in my family to go to college and whatnot, that there's actually a really big disconnect sometimes between sort of people who are in the bougier kind of like tech world of people who make above 100K and so forth. There's actually a data point that I think was really powerful for me when I realized this, because I didn't actually think, this is how embedded mass incarceration is. I didn't actually think that was that special. I didn't think that there was anything special about that. I thought everyone had a family member who died in prison because that's how common mass incarceration is in America. And before I went to college and when I was coming from a lower income background, that was pretty common. And when you look at the data, I think it's roughly half of Americans know someone who's been arrested, but which half is important? Because when you disaggregate that by income, it's actually, I think, above 100K income brackets, only a third of people know the person who's been arrested. You go to felony convictions, it gets less and less and less. And so I think there's a pretty big disconnect sometimes with with kind of the tech and the data world and what people are producing relative to impacted organizations. So I think that there's something powerful about having kind of tech and research that's developed in an impacted organization that's directly connected to the work. So I got connected with Desmond, and it's was part of Amendment 4, which is one of the reasons. It was a bigger reason, and they hit us with fines and fees, and it became less of a reason. But it was one of the big reasons for the drop in the number of disenfranchised folks. Florida had a ban for life if you had a felony conviction, unless you got clemency from the governor, which, going back to the English system of begging from the feudal lord for your clemency rights, that was essentially what you had to do in Florida. And so we passed, I was a big part of passing Amendment 4, and we've actually run our own randomized controlled trials, RCTs, for about 5 years on a variety of different topics within Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, both in terms of engaging returning citizens. So we take what is usually the end of people's story on a Google search, meaning their conviction, whatever, and we just kind of see that as the beginning of the conversation. We want to know who's impacted, right? That's I wish the data didn't exist. I wish that people could actually be anonymous and that people's record wasn't published, and that's scarlet that it didn't exist. But given that it does, we see that as just an entry point to have a conversation with folks. Both people who are incarcerated. We've prototyped some models that are a little bit different than Initiate Justice, but are kind of on a similar idea, which is around engaging the impacted loved one through a relational program that actually gets them to vote on the issues on behalf of their incarcerated person. So it's a kind of a relational network that we've built around that, and we've seen some of the highest turnout rates in among kind of non-disenfranchised impacted loved ones in that group. We've done RCTs on canvassing and phone banking around and many other types of outreach around specifically the justice impacted people themselves actually reaching out, and that was a big part of Amendment 4, right? How we pass. I mean, when Mr. Lilly was talking earlier, I was just hearing the kind of the core model that we had developed in Amendment 4, which was that at that time, Desmond and everybody else was going around saying, "Hey, you have to vote because I can't." And so the incarcerated people, or the formerly incarcerated people, and who were out in the community, and incarcerated people as well, were getting their loved ones to vote on their behalf, and that was really what powered Amendment 4, was that love vote, the movement that was based on our loved ones. And so we've actually been able to prototype a lot of this, and we're starting to spread the wealth, right? I mean, we've got technology that we've actually built in-house. So I think most of the advocacy work, we have to rely on kind of tools that are based on existing voters, right? And so we have had to kind of refactor and re-architect this entire the entire stack to really be focused on our people and engaging folks who may not be registered voters and who may not necessarily be on the file and have the same kind of data points that we've used in kind of voter outreach. And so that's been something really powerful, and I think I have 30 seconds, so I hope that I hope that there will actually be more collaboration kind of between either embedding data scientists throughout the movement, kind of in different research orgs, so that they can be connected kind of directly to the needs of organizers and of incarcerated people, of formerly incarcerated people, and continuing to build out this this technology and data that's kind of for us and by us.
Thanks so much, Al. Yeah, I think that's exactly the conversation that we want to seed, and I think that this is hopefully the beginning of the conversation, right? I mean, not the beginning of the conversation. I think these conversations have been happening, but this can be one step along the way in many conversations towards how we expand that network, and it is perhaps the question we're going to get to if we have enough time. Look like to scale, to scale these, and are there national initiatives that we can that folks around the country can plug into. But for now, Jarvis, I wanted to turn to you. Forward Justice has partnered with research teams to look at what effective strategies of engaging justice-impacted people in North Carolina are. And I was wondering what takeaways you have from someone with a campaign and data background that's also in a community organization, about that process and how organizations can utilize that kind of research to advance your campaigns.
First of all, thank you, Bob, for having me. The Sentencing Project, thanks to you as well. So as gracious as the state of North Carolina is in letting an individual know that they cannot vote, they are not as gracious in letting them know that they are eligible to vote. So that's where, Forward Justice, we come into play. Because of the data that we have received, we've birthed two campaigns at Forward Justice. The first campaign is the Unlock Our Vote campaign, where we're fighting for equal access to the voting booth through that campaign, which argues that everyone should be able to have their right to vote, no matter what their criminal history is. The next campaign is the our Protect Our Vote campaign that serves as our safeguard campaign, where we defend unconstitutional voter suppression and disenfranchisement tactics on behalf of the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP in its litigation. In its litigation efforts. And this covers lawsuits and federal and state courts as well. An illustration of kind of how we use that data for these campaigns is in 2022, the Unlock Our Vote campaign, we received data from the North Carolina Administration Office of the Courts. And in this data set, there were almost 56,000 people who had their rights restored that were justice impacted people. Once we received that list, it was time to take action. We're not one of those organizations that just kind of sits there on that data. Like, we wanted to immediately take action. So what we did as a result, we achieved a 14% phone bank interaction rate, where we were, contacting individuals, letting them know of their eligibility. In addition, we sent out almost 90,000 text messages, where we received inbound 5,200 messages. And during those conversations, we assisted these individuals on completing their voter registration forms. Like, we didn't want to just let you know, like, hey, you're registered to vote. Like, we want to actually walk you through that process and make sure that you complete it, because we know, especially in the South, with these voter registration forms, they'll find any and everything to disqualify you. So we wanted to make sure that we covered our tracks with that. In addition to that, we sent out 106,000 direct mail pieces through 3 mailing cycles. And with those efforts, we were ultimately able to register 33% of those people, of those 56,000 people, and 16% of those people actually casted a ballot. So that was a huge plus for us. We had never done something like this before. So, we had so much success then that we're now going to, take on that role again this summer. That was what we call the Unlock Our Vote Freedom Summer campaign that I just, shot those numbers out to you, but we're actually going to do that again. And when we began the process this year, planning our field efforts around registering individuals, we received a list of 25,000 people this year that would be eligible to vote. But working with Al, we've now discovered that we have about 170,000 people in North Carolina that are justice impacted people that are eligible to vote. They just don't know. And that's where, like I said earlier, where we come into play and play a small role in just kind of letting these individuals know that they are eligible. With our Protect Our Vote campaign, we use our data a little bit differently. It's mostly handled internally. So over the past 5 years, we've on election days, we have a hotline that's mainly manned by our legal staff, and they're fielding calls from voters who are experiencing voter intimidation at their voting polling sites. We use this data as a support mechanism in our legal procedures. And we also, address the issues, head on right then. From that, what we've decided to do with that data is to launch our Protect Our Vote tour this summer as well. where the places where we receive high concentration numbers of reports of voter intimidation, issues at the polling locations. Like, we're going to go to those communities this summer and talk to these individuals, educate them. We have our communications team has created a toolkit to be able to like clearly speak on, you know, how North Carolina laws have changed, very unconstitutional laws. We're actually about to be in court with them over the voter ID, continuing a case that we have with them, the state of North Carolina, dealing with these voter ID laws. So those are just kind of some of the ways that we're using our data, two totally different ways. You know, we all have a duty to want to participate in allowing these individuals and getting this message out to people. It's not just North Carolina it's happening in, it's, you know, in Mississippi. That's, you know, it's in Alabama, it's in Florida, like it's everywhere. And we just need to be more engaged, like, you know, as even on the front end, as far as how we're obtaining this data. Where do you go and obtain this data? One of the things that I like about being a part of this panel is, you know, when we were prepping for it, you know, everyone was, you know, speaking about what the work that they're doing. And when you're in these specific settings like this, you kind of get so caught up into your own state and what you're doing and the tactics that you're using, that it's always a pleasure to be able to, you know, connect with other individuals in other states to see what type of things they're doing with the work. And that's one of the major pluses that I've taken for being a part of this group. And once again, I want to thank Bob and the Sentencing Project for having me, the panelists as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jarvis. That was excellent. Always great to hear from the Forward Justice team. And I think that, so there are a number of questions in the chat, and if our panelists can check the Q&A as well, because there are some questions that are directed to specific panelists that I think would be helpful if folks can answer. The very first question, though, which is one that I think is also a question for me, right? And I think is essentially, how do we scale this, right? How do we scale these kind of efforts? Is there a model that is being created to start these initiatives in every state? What states have been involved so far? And I recognize we might not want to, you know, call out people's work who are just beginning it or for various reasons, but I am curious if any of our panelists outside of these conversations can talk about efforts to provide resources or tools to other state advocates who might be interested in undertaking these kinds of research initiatives as they relate to enfranchisement campaigns. And so I'll just open it up to the panel and see if anybody has a way to kick that conversation off.
I'll kick it off, Bob. So my background is campaign. So I come up in the business working as a field organizer on campaigns. And over the past 20 years or so, we've operated out of a system that every campaign, most liberal organizations operate out of. It's a technology system. It's just this one particular system. The only thing that I guess once I began working on this particular issue of criminal justice reform and voting rights, like, it did not cater to our people, our messaging. Like, there's a lot of things in there that we just don't need, and it just doesn't fit what we're trying to do. But as I said earlier, working with Al at FRRC, Al has created something that's beautiful. It's dynamic. It is specific to what, you know, we need. There's several issues, you know, when it comes to criminal justice reform. You know, if it's driver's license restoration, you know, when it comes to expungement clinics, individuals that just have misdemeanors, they're directly impacted as well by the criminal justice system, not just because you have a felony, but being able to like separate those lanes and see what's important to certain people in certain areas of our state. is huge for us with this system, this new technology system that we'll be using. And that's just one of the ways that I think that this movement will move forward, is by being able to exactly identify the issue, and you know exactly who that person is and where that person's at. That's going to cut out on a lot of dead time that previously we've had to weave through, but now with Al's creation, we won't have to experience that as far as technology and organizing.
Great. Thank you, Jarvis. Al, you want to?
Thanks. But yeah, definitely. You know, I think that's definitely it's been great. You know, working with Jarvis and team, and you know, we did some work in Minnesota last year, and are continuing to this year. Louisiana is starting up, and a couple of other states. But yeah, we really are. You know, we're really excited to. And you know, I don't think it's just a tech problem. I think there's a lot of really interesting organizing models. I'm looking forward to following up on with the panelists here and a lot of the folks in the chat. I'm trying to take all my notes on all the cool stuff that people are doing. But yeah, so I think that, you know, technology is definitely it helps, and it's one piece of it. Data helps, right? I think like being able to you know, not so I've seen everything from people creating kind of like modeled scores of like whether someone's incarcerated. And to me that's you know, this is public information for the most part, and so we try to just like really use relationships that formerly incarcerated people usually have, right? It's easier for us sometimes to get data from different actors in the criminal justice system than it is for other people, and because we know, right? We know, okay, you got to go to this person, you got to get this, you got to do that. And so yeah, I think there's a you know, there's a model that it's not one size fits all, right? I mean, every criminal justice system is completely different. I know even when we did the panel at the conference, right? You had people saying, well, date of birth doesn't exist in my state, and you know, this and that, and you know, and then the disenfranchisement laws are different, and so we need to actually have methods that are not just, you know, a voter is a voter, and I can just assume, all right, if this person's on the rolls and they, you know, have a driver's license in North Carolina or whatever, that they can vote. You know, but you actually, in some cases, I mean, I have you know, I have a phone bank where we are reading off the case and county information of the fines and fees that we paid when we spent $30 million paying people's fines and fees to try to, you know, help people navigate these barriers. And you know, and that's what you have to do in Florida, right? You almost need a lawyer to tell you if you can vote. But there's a, you know, and then in other states it's a lot simpler. I think like North Carolina, it's you know, even though the state doesn't tell you, right, that you're eligible, right? We can do, you know, we can do that. And so yeah, I think there's this organizing model that we're kind of all making a patchwork quilt out of together in the different states is going to be really, really powerful. And you know, we're happy to continue to share anything that we can develop.
And if I could just add one little thing to that, you know, Al makes a really good point that every state is very different. Every state's data sources that are very different. There's a question in here about, you know, where do you get lists of eligible voters and things like that. I mean, first, I'm not aware of any state really that provides a list of eligible voters, but rather they'll provide you a list of people who voted at some point or registered, right? That typically the voter file you can get. But identifying like who is actually eligible is a lot. It actually can take a lot of work depending on because they don't really create that. Although some states, Mississippi has lists of people who are banned from voting, so that's interesting. But one of the points I want to make about this idea that all these different states are doing different things, you know, kind of political science 101 talks about the laboratories of democracy. We have the 50 states, and every state does their own thing. And I think what's really nice, you know, that can be a huge pain in a lot of ways, but it can also be kind of nice because you can look to a state like Florida and say, okay, here's something similar that they have one component in Florida, and we can lift that from them to see what they, you know, to apply it in our state. But then we can look at North Carolina, or we can look at Texas, or we can look at Minnesota, for these other elements and kind of put together your own thing. The other thing I want to just mention is, sometimes there's everybody has a variety of different skills. And I just, speaking as somebody who also is, works as an academic, I also want you to I just want to encourage people to also consider reaching out to, people at universities and things like that, especially people who write on this work. Maybe they can't directly help you, or maybe won't be able to do it, but they might have students that can. They might be able to put you in the right direction, like, somebody whose work more closely aligns. And I think you might have a welcome, so you reaching out might, for most people at least, would be welcome. So.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in if I may, Bob.
Yeah, absolutely, Robert.
So like my take on the question would be to take what is being done down there and initiate justice and duplicate that concept of reaching into the prison system. When I was in recently, I did 4 years in the last 5 years. I've been home now for a year, especially in the state of Texas. I'm referring to this as an important matter. We are starving for information inside the institutions. We yearn, we write organizations and we get no answers. They have these lists that are outdated of resources that organizations that say that they make us a priority, but they don't demonstrate that in their responses to us. So what I believe we've got to do is go back to the 70s and that dynamic inside-outside organizing that took place then, and start building deeper and more meaningful coalitions with those on the inside as a springboard to relationships with those on the outside that are going to be fired up because of the loss of their contact with their loved ones that are incarcerated. That is a pain driver in those family systems that only can be soothed, I believe, to the extent that people be motivated to get involved in the process. So that's one. Secondly, and the last comment I'll make is, thankfully to my director, Annette Price, and Grassroots leadership, I have a role to play as an organizer in a nonprofit organization that's doing meaningful work to engage people. More of this needs to happen. Lastly, I would also say that I'm looking at the list of people that are on this list of people that came to this meeting today. We need to get together face to face. I know there's a conference coming up. Thankfully, I'll be at that conference with Ms. Walker and others. But we need more space. I need to look on the website and see more spaces that are holding this conversation in person so that we can get acquainted with each other, learn from one another, and figure out how we can be more cooperative on a national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Rob, thank you so much for what you named, because that was essentially going to be the contribution that I was going to add to this question, which was essentially our motto is absolutely replicable wherever you are in the nation. It is basically pen and paper, visiting rooms. Our organization was established in a prison visiting room. Go with your loved ones to visit your loved ones, have these conversations. And like Rob said, pen and paper is essentially how we still sustain our inside-outside organizing model. We receive hundreds of letters, we respond, we keep our resource lists up to date. We address the questions and the concerns that people are asking for. And when we send out our next edition of our periodic political education resource journal, we answer the questions that are being asked by the people inside from us. And so just echoing in terms of the model that we were founded upon is absolutely replicable, so long as you are talking to the people who are impacted by your justice system in your state. Our entire team, our board of directors, are people who are directly impacted, formerly incarcerated, and people like myself who have been navigating the system for loved ones who have been incarcerated or are currently incarcerated. And those are the people you need to be talking to, and those are the people that you need to have in leadership roles at your organizations, guiding your campaigns and developing your organizing strategies. And that is how you can replicate this work anywhere you are.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you, Antoinette, and thank you to our panelists. This has been a really terrific conversation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, at the Sentencing Project, we convene these kind of conversations and we put out research related to trends on voting rights for people with felony convictions. And so we really hope that this is, one of many conversations that we have throughout this year as we, gear up towards a really big election in the fall. And as we're seeing the implementation and the fruits of many of the advocacy campaigns that the people on this call and around the country have won over the last few years to make millions of people eligible to vote. And so what we'll commit to do is sending a follow-up email with many of the resources that you've heard today, and also convening more of these conversations over the course of the year about how voting rights work can really be transformative, as you've heard from many of our panelists, and how we can really be documenting that transformation as the movement towards full enfranchisement continues to take shape. So again, join me in thanking our panelists and our wonderful behind the scenes crew who makes this possible at the Sentencing Project. We really appreciate you, Morgan and Brianna and Nicole, for making this happen. And until next time, we'll see you soon.